Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Indy Investor Pod. So, Brett, I got you joining me here today. And basically, so you and I had a conversation the other day, and we said, hey, you and I need to do an episode because we haven't done an episode in a while. And always like having you on here and stuff. And I said, what do you want to talk about? Like, what can we have an episode for the Indie Pod about? And you're like, well, I'm Mr. Process guy, so I got to do all about processes. So
I know. It's like my favorite topic. That's, my top three are processes, visionary, but yeah, processes. I love it.
so
It's a needed thing. That is for sure. It's like
yeah,
insurance. It's like, you don't want to talk about it, but you need it.
there we go. That's exactly right. And generally, if you know Brett at all, Brett will be the first one to break the process, but we need to have that process in place and stuff. And no, within a business, Brett, I think it's so important. It's one of those things that's overlooked. Like you said, it's not like, you talk about the insurance and stuff like that. It's not sexy. It's not that thing that's going to you're going to excite everybody. It excites some people. And those people are usually the people that are like your operations people and stuff like that. But, when it comes to processes, it's so important to have these in place for your business to grow, to scale, to just do little things. I've talked to a lot of people that even just have small operations and they don't have a team or anything, but it's just even them themselves. But like working through with them on like what a process is and putting process in place of how important and how it changes like just what they're doing. I know you've even mentioned of like, even just with your kids, like you have a process with them on like, hey, in the morning, here's your like morning routine, because we all know that you can throw something out there, especially to a kid, you can tell them 10 times, but you know what, that's, you have to tell them 10 times because you don't have that process in place that you review and you go over and stuff like that. So let's just
Exactly.
start with the basics of just even that, of like, just how important is a process to a business, to what you're doing, and just basically how important that is to a real estate investor.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is something that I have not done well, especially early in my career as a real estate investor. And I didn't have any process. I kept everything in my head and I kind of just winged my business, and I knew I was making money, but and I thought, hey, I don't really need that because I was the only person on the team and I don't need to train anybody because I wasn't hiring anybody. And, but I think that that was a huge lie and a huge mistake for me. Um, Even if you're watching this and you're a one person show and you're the only person in your wholesale business or real estate business, having a process is super important. How do you do things? Because number one, I think it really helps you keep organized. Um, and like you said, Brian, like even with my kids and when I'm around my house, even my personal life, I'm always trying to think about how can I do things a little bit better? How can I organize my life a little bit more? And, one process is that, I haven't always done very well is budgeting, right? And I think budgeting is super important in your business. It's also super important in your personal life. If you really want to build wealth and to build freedom and to do all that, you need to know what you're doing with your money, how much you're spending and all that. And so we'll just kind of start off with that. It's super important to have a process with that. How do you budget? What categories are you putting these expenses into certain buckets? How many times a month or a year do you review your budget? So a lot of it is just planning, because if you don't plan and you don't have any type of rhythm to it or any type of process, it just doesn't get done. So I think that it's so important, and especially if you're looking to grow, right? So even if you're a one person business and you want to hire somebody someday, starting now is super important, because if you have a team, processes become way more important, because now you have to get whatever you have in your head onto a document or a spreadsheet or a CRM, whatever it is, because you got to train someone else to do it, to like your team. So, if I tell my employee to do something, then that's one thing, but all of a sudden your team starts to grow, and like now your employee has to tell this employee to do something, and then stuff gets lost in translation. It's like the telephone game, right? It's like you tell some person and they tell some person, and then by the end it's nothing to do with what you wanted, what you even said in the first place. So I think that as you grow, I think you're going to be so thankful to have processes in your business.
Yeah, and it's just like, you talk about growth and having people on your team and stuff like that. You all know that, like, kind of that telephone thing. But if you have, you have three people, like, for example, we have three acquisition managers on our team. So people that are going out and finding properties for us, talking to the motivated sellers, getting them under contract and things like that. But if we don't have processes in place and review those processes, basically what ends up happening is each of those three people end up doing it a different way. And the paperwork looks different. It gets stored at a different place. It's all those things come into play and just makes things more efficient across your business. So when we're talking about processes, we're really, that's just like the first part of it. There's like three different parts to this whole thing of, like, you have a process, you have a procedure, and you have a policy. To break this down a little bit, to kind of just mainstream these and kind of put them all together and put a nice little bow around it. The way I like to explain this is basically you have a process, which is what you're doing. That explains kind of what's going on and what you need to do, the steps it takes, that type of thing. Then you have your procedure, which is how you're doing it. So whether it's written out on paper, whether it's a video, any of those things, that's the procedure that it takes to do that process. The last part is the policy. That kind of comes into, like, how long does it take? So, like, it's the when. I also like to include the why in that. So you have your process, which is the what, you have the procedure, which is the how, and then you have your policy, which is kind of the when and the why. So how long does it take to do this? When is it expected to be done by? But then also I like to include the why in that, of, like, what happens if this doesn't work out, or if you don't get this timeline done or anything like that, but also why this affects everybody in our team if it doesn't get done a certain way. So I think that's really important. But Brett, going back to kind of what you were talking about, you're talking about that process and, like, getting those thoughts basically out of people's heads. Because this is what happens all the time, especially with entrepreneurs, things like that. They have they start doing things, they're doing things on their own. And then all of a sudden, oh, I need to hire a virtual assistant, or I need to hire a boots on the ground, or I need to bring on a bookkeeper, or I need to bring on a lawyer, or an insurance stuff. All the things that if you're working with somebody else, even if it's not building your team, if you're working with separate contractors, or your team of third party vendors, things like that, everything needs a process of, like, when does something go out to them? How does it go? Where is it stored? Where can you find it? Because it happens all the time. We're sitting there of, like, we just had something go on this week of basically where we had an eviction on a property, but something fell down or something broke down within the process. We were missing one piece of information. All of a sudden our eviction gets, continued for another 3 weeks, and we can't proceed on it right now because we missed one thing along that process and it held things up. So Brett, when you're kind of talking about when we look at those three pieces of, like, the process of what's being done, the procedure of how it's being done, and the policy of, like, when and why it needs done, putting all those three of those things together, how important is that to that business? But then also, as somebody that it stays in your head, or it's in your head, and you're not the guy that, like, puts that on paper and stuff like that and keeps it nice and neat, or it might break down and things like that. How important is it too to just, like, to carry that out and to stick to those things and work those things, and for people to understand what those processes are and how they mean and what they mean to your business?
Yeah, like I said, it's super important, and I don't want to overwhelm anyone watching this, because whenever you start talking about some of these, the process, procedures, the policies, if you're like me and you're kind of a visionary, then you get a little overwhelmed. You're like, man, I don't want to do that or talk about that. Um, and Brian talked about this isn't really a sexy topic, but honestly, this can really be sexy, because, like, the goal for me in this whole thing was freedom. Right. I mean, I do the Freedom Fridays. I talk about freedom, financial freedom, freedom to do what you want with your time and have the money to do it. That's what I talk about a lot. Well, I'm going to tell you something, and I think you'll think the processes are sexy, because if you don't have processes, you will never be free. It's just, you won't
Yeah.
ever. So if you don't want to do this and your goal is financial freedom, I'm sorry, you just won't be free. So that's where it gets interesting, and that's where it can be really, really sexy. So whenever I do anything now, I'm always thinking about, how can I develop a process with this, make it a simple process? And I always say simple. I was like, can a fifth grader, Brian used to be a teacher, can a fifth grader understand this process,
Yep.
right? Because if I'm using technical terms and, all this real estate jargon, and I hire a VA, like they don't they don't know any of that stuff, right? So I just think make it a simple process, and we have the technology these days, guys, to do a lot. We're so far advanced than we were when I first started 13, 14 years ago. It's crazy. And you can simplify your business in an amazing way, right? We have a CRM system that tracks all of our leads that come in. That's a process. And we have a process within the CRM. How do we track them? Where do we put them at? How do we organize it? And all of that. With the technology, and what I started doing was just start simple. I started writing things down on a document, trying to do instructions. Were they, always the most sexy instructions and with all these colors and just pretty? No, it was just, but it was just getting started, right? It was just getting something down, getting something out of my head, and that was just kind of a start. And then I always like creating videos, so you can do a screen video of whatever you're doing to create that process, because when someone else needs to learn how to do it, I think a set of instructions, and then I'm more of a visual, and I like to listen and watch what's going on. That's why when I want to learn how to do something, like put something together, I don't read the instructions. I watch a YouTube video, because I learn better by watching someone actually doing it. So I create a video of how I do things, and that's just the start of the process. We can go a lot more in depth, and that's where Brian kind of came in. So that was a simplified version. Here's my instructions, here's my video. And then I asked him, can you make this better, right? As they start doing it, and they start taking it from there. Brian then took it even further, and we got diagrams and sheets and all that. But I would just say the simple, just start doing videos and instructions, and processing out how you do things. And we can go into, Brian, if you want to, all the different things that we do, or we can break it down just a few. But I think that's a good start.
Yeah, and I think it's a rabbit hole, honestly, with me with a lot of this stuff, because I like things neat, and I'm pretty anal about stuff like that. And like, for example, so we use Lucid Chart to do a lot of our to show a lot of our process and procedures and policies and things like that. Lucid Chart is basically like a whole visual diagram, and it's got a bunch of lines and swim lanes and process here and end process, beginning process, all this type of thing. And when we're talking about processes, it can get to that, but it doesn't have to be that. Like, it's very easy to get overwhelmed, like looking at something, when you're looking at this huge visual of like what our follow-up system looks like. It's pretty in depth, but it looks great and it's nice and visual and stuff like that, but it takes a lot to get to that point. So, I mean, it can really just start with, some basic stuff like Brett said, of just like, can you get it on paper? Can you do a checklist of basically like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and just operate off of a spreadsheet or a doc or something like that is a very easy way to start. And then kind of that next step is like, what I would recommend is taking that and then putting it into something like Trello or Asana or something like that, where it is a little bit more in depth, and you can move stuff around, and it's now not just on paper, but it's kind of virtual. It lives within a website, and you can change things and drop things in and do videos and things like that. I think is really important. Then you can go to something like that's really in depth, like a Lucid Chart or some of those things where you can make it actual visual and color coded and all this stuff for your team to follow. But I think one of the things that, when it comes to putting that process out and talking about the process and procedures and policies and putting that out there for yourself or your team or your vendors or any of that stuff, of the steps to go through of, hey, if I want to buy a property, here are all the things that need to happen. If I want to put an offer in on the property, here are all the things that need to happen. If I want to send a new property to my property manager, here are all the steps that needs to happen. And here's how I'm going to do it. And here's when I need to do each and all those steps. So that's all one thing. And that's all super, super important. The second part to that is just as important, is to review those processes just as much as possible. So, to really get in there, what I've seen from so many different things and working with so many different, companies on this and talking to different real estate investors, of what happens all the time. And when we've actually fallen in this trap too, of like Brett said, like Brian took it to the next level and I made all these nice visuals and things like that. It's only so often, or it only takes so much time till one of our team members falls off of that. And yes, I have this nice visual, this nice process and procedure, color coded and lines going everywhere and stuff like that. But to one of our team members forgets what's within that process and why we do those things. And they start doing it their own way because, oh, here's a shortcut for it, or this happened and this wasn't on there, and so I just did it my own way and stuff. So taking the time to review what's going on with that is just as important as actually having that process in place, because that process is nothing unless you can go over it and everybody's, kind of on the same page, and they're living, breathing documents. So there's things that can be changed, and they should be changed, and they should be, updated and simplified and become more efficient within what you're doing too, and stuff. So I think, Brett, when we kind of take it to that level of just even like reviewing it and making sure that everybody's on the same page with that, what, like, you've seen the transition of kind of taking things like off of, out of your head and then having them on paper. And then, but actually when you get into that process of reviewing things with your executive assistant, or, one of our virtual assistants, or one of our team members, of how that kind of changed the game for us a little bit too, and just kind of ingrained it more within our kind of team culture of like, hey, this is the process, this is what we need to stick to. And everybody's just not, a gunslinger winging it out there on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's so important to take time to review because again, as you grow and things do change somewhat, right? And your process could change because now you're adding this new position. So, when I first got started, I was kind of by myself, and I would be the one. I would answer the phone, make my own appointment, go out and see it, get under a contract. I'd send to the title company and do all the closing. I had to go to the closing and all that. And it was just kind of in my head, but then I hired someone else to take the phone calls. Now, like, okay, now they take the phone calls, and then they got to set up my appointment. But how do they do it? Do they put it on my calendar? And you got all these different things. So it just changes a little bit. So I think as you grow, it's good to review. And then you also have new ideas, right? I mean, we're always coming up with new ideas. How can we make this simpler, better? What if we do this? So we start putting in, hey, instead of making the appointment, maybe we should pre-qualify them a little bit more. Maybe we can get the deal over the phone. Well, that's a different thing, right? So the process could change a little bit because of, we have to do things virtually now a little bit more. So I think it's super important. I think, we review our processes and review kind of our one-page plan and kind of what we're doing at least, once a quarter, and Brian, more about this area, but I think, it doesn't have to be that, but as you go, it's important to have a rhythm, right?
Yeah.
Whatever you're doing, it's important to have a rhythm and to plan, because again, if you don't plan it, it just doesn't happen, right? It's like, for an example, if you want to go on a date night with your spouse and you don't plan it, it just goes, and you got 2 months, 3 months go by, and like, man, we haven't had a date night in forever. And it's because you didn't plan it. You didn't have any rhythm to it. So whatever you're doing, have a rhythm, review it once a quarter or once a year. I don't know, but just get something down.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I'll just kind of relate it back to kind of what we do, and everybody's going to be different and stuff, but just to be a little transparent about kind of what's going on with us. So within our business, we have 12 different like large processes that we hold and we go over. It's from, how we market for properties, incoming leads, follow up, putting out, the way our acquisitions like run their appointments, things like that. And then also getting into, buying the actual property, the transactions piece, the marketing piece, the dispo piece. So we have 12 large, kind of basically large processes that we go over. So that makes it really easy, where you can basically have, Brett kind of mentioned like once a quarter. It's like works out perfectly for us. Maybe I kind of designed it that way, but we came up with 12 because there's like 12 or 13 weeks within a quarter. So we can kind of review and go over them each time, and stuff like that. So every week we're going over a different type of a process. And then all of a sudden within a quarter, we've gone over all of them again. Sometimes those meetings might last like 3 hours because we have to dig into a process and change it and fix it and stuff like that. We might have to say like, hey, we need to like redo this whole thing. We need to look at this completely fresh because this doesn't work anymore. We need to fix this. Sometimes we get into one of those meetings to go over a process. It might last 5 minutes because we look at it and be like, yep, everything's good. This is how everybody does it. This is how everybody's good. And we move on. But we still take the time to kind of look at it and dig into it and check it out that way, which I think is really important. So, and one of the things I kind of want to mention too, of within that, there's always these kind of big, these big overwhelming processes. But one of the things that we really kind of struggled with last year is within those big processes, there were a bunch of small processes that we didn't necessarily have documented and going over, such as how to fill out a certain web form, or how to fill out this document for property management, and then where does it go? Does everybody have access to it? Oh, only this person has access to it. So how does everybody else get it? Those types of things. So within those small little things, that's what you kind of also need to be reviewing and making sure that they are there. And within that too, of people always ask me like, so where do I start? What do I, how do I get started doing this? The most common answer for people are always like, prioritize what makes you money. So that's a good point. That's really good. What I've also realized is when people do that, when people say that, they miss out on all the things that don't necessarily make them money, but are very important, that could possibly lose you a lot of money. So there's the things that, for example, we've gone through this within our business. And I think a lot of real estate investors go through this too, especially as their team does grow and they're working with a bunch of different contractors, things like that. They focus a lot on the acquisitions, the dispositions, the transactions, those types of things. But then the processes that usually kind of end up suffering or not getting kind of attended to a little bit more are like things like the insurances. Do all of the properties have insurance on? What's the process for that? How does that go? Or how does that happen? What does, with the property management, or all the things in place and stuff like that, that sometimes don't necessarily make you money, but when something falls behind within that, or you miss something, can actually cost the business a little bit of money on the back end and stuff like that. So Brett, when it comes to that kind of stuff of, I think it's really easy for real estate investors to kind of get into and be like, hey, this is the process that we need to look at first, because this is how we buy properties and sell properties and stuff like that. But from you being a business owner on that back end of all those processes, that kind of, the behind the scenes stuff and things like that. And I know you're actually working with my wife on that stuff now within our business, because well, honestly, like we not that we neglected it or that we were like at fault for anything like that, but it was on our back burner. We focused on the stuff that made us money, and maybe some of the other stuff that didn't get cleaned up.
Yeah.
So looking at from that end of going back and having to fix some of that stuff too, that's one of the things actually, Brett, within, you kind of went through even like last year or 2 years ago with like a bookkeeper, of like the process that we were working with a bookkeeper, of like, it took a lot of time to get that cleaned up because we didn't have that process down. This year it's taken a lot of stuff with kind of the insurance within the business, and kind of some of the behind the scenes stuff that maybe entrepreneurs don't even like realize or know, because they're so focused on making the money. So when it comes to that part of it, of like having to go back and fix a process or clean up a process, of where you have that mindset of like, man, I should have done this from the start. How
Yeah.
important that really is to like kind of focus on that when we are talking about process and procedures and policies and things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I think that I've just been entrenched working in the business, just like a lot of you, for so long. You just forget about some of these things. You just keep chugging along. Um, and the one thing is, once you do start growing and you start scaling and you start to build wealth, right? You have to really think about these things. So, before I didn't really have to think about much about protection. And that's just what Brian was talking about. A lot of the insurance and the entity structure, and should I start an LLC? And at first, when people come to me and they're like, hey, and they've never done a deal before, and they say, should I start an LLC or an S corp, or insurance and stuff like that? And I might say, yeah, it's fine, but don't worry about that. Start making money, right? And but if you are making money and you do have a business and things are going pretty well, then I would say, yes, you really need to focus on these things, these processes. And that's what I'm focused on. There's entity structure. Like, how do you structure things to protect what you've built? How do you protect your business? How do you protect your family? Tax planning. And that's the thing that gets pushed on the back burner so much. And that's the most expensive expense of a business owner, of anybody, is your taxes. And we don't realize that, but most of the time people don't think about their taxes until their accountant does their return and like, oh, holy crap, I got a lot of money back, or holy crap, I have to pay a lot of money. And that's just where they're at. So I think it's really important to plan, like, meet with your accountants, and what does the process look like for all of that? And again, it's about the rhythms and just kind of getting on the same page. Marketing, I think, is one thing that a lot of businesses and wholesalers don't have a process for. Most of the time they're like, oh, I got $2,000. I'm going to put it on direct mail and see what happens. And then they spend it. And then like, a couple months later, like, oh, I need to spend more money on marketing. And they're just winging it. Right. So there need to be like, hey, I'm going to spend this much money on marketing on these channels, and every month, every quarter, whatever, and just having a process with that. So Brian, I would just say where do people start too is like, I don't know who's listening to this and what your business looks like, but just like, what are the things that you're doing, right? Like everything that you're doing should have a process. That's going to overwhelm you. Like, oh my gosh, that's going to take forever. Just start off small, right? This week, just do one. It's like, okay, what do I do with the lead when it comes in? And just start off that. The next week, okay, if I get a property under contract, what do I do with that? And just start
Yeah.
off there. So I would just start off small.
Yeah. I want to make an offer on the house. What is that process? What does that look like? Who's going to make that offer for you? Like just getting that on paper and then knowing you kind of what to do with that. Because best case in point is that you have those in place. All of a sudden you have to bring somebody on your team and have to do that for you. There you go. That process is down and stuff. So a quick, you brought up the point about like kind of marketing and things like that. So I had a big faux pas like last week of actually where I messed up within our process. And yeah, I'm the process person on our team, but I messed it up because what I did, I basically integrated tried a new list into our thing of just like, hey, somebody was like, hey, can you try this new list? See how it works? Give me some feedback. I'm like, yeah, I'll, try it. I'll, whatever. Free leads. Yeah. To give it here and I'll figure it out and stuff. What I did though, I took this new list and put it into our existing process that we do with our regular list. You know what? That process didn't work for that new list. And actually we ended up sending out, mail for properties where instead of like getting rid of the duplicates and stuff like that, our old process took care of it for our other list that we usually get. Our new list didn't take care of that. And all of a sudden I threw in a new list into our existing process. It basically messed up and I ended up basically wasting some money because I sent duplicate mail to the same owners and same houses and stuff like that. And that's where I messed up. I took something and tried to put it into took something new and put it into an existing process without reviewing it, without looking at it, and just kind of winging it. And that's what happens and stuff. And really what that comes down to is time and money out of what we were doing and stuff. So it can affect your business and go from there. And then just getting back to like what Brett kind of started with, or what Brett was talking about, is like, where do you start? What do you do? Just what are all the things that you do within your business? What happens? Are you a buy and hold investor? List out all the things that you're doing to figure out what you need to buy buy whatever properties you are. What do you need to figure out with your goals? What is your goal number one? And then work it backwards of like, what are all the things that need to happen for me to reach that goal? And then kind of coming up with a process of what you need to do for each of those things. If you're a flipper, what is the process for you to, find properties, how you work with contractors, how you do stuff, how you pay contractors, all that stuff, work out that process. If you're a wholesaler, what is that process for an incoming lead? And, for working those leads, for follow up those leads, come up with all the different just list of processes. Start with a list and then put it into a system and then put it into basically something that can work, for you with your videos that explain how to do it and all that type of stuff too, and the when and the why along those things. So Brett, anything else you can add to it of just like, whether it's the important of processes or maybe a mistake that we've even made that maybe somebody can learn from, or anything else that you want to throw into this podcast and talk about before we get out of here today?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing too is if you're like me, I just want something simple. I want to go back to that. Because you can also overdo this.
Yeah.
I've seen companies that they got processes out the wazoo and they're not doing any deals because they're focused on the processes. They're super complicated. This does sends it over here. And I'm like, well, how many deals do you do? And they're like, no, haven't done one yet. But I have all this stuff. So for me, and we've had complicated processes and we said, this is just too complicated. And we've gone back to like a Google spreadsheet, Brian, even we've done that on, kind of keeping check of our properties and where they're at. And we used to have them try to do it in our CRM. And like, this isn't working. Let's just go back to the spreadsheet. So I would just say, I don't know your personality, but don't overdo it. I just keep it simple because someone else, especially if you're going to grow and scale, is going to have to follow this. And they're maybe you're a super detailed person and they might not be. right? So do a simplified, and just make sure you're not overdoing it. And so you're just not overwhelming yourself, not overwhelming your team. And like I said, just kind of start off small, and just make sure you're doing something, and just kind of moving forward, and eventually you'll have processes for everything.
Yeah. So love it. And how do we get started? We just started with something, pretty basic. We went to the, with traction and the entrepreneurial operating system, the EOS. That's how we got started. Just like, hey, we put this, we took these and basically we needed a system for this, kind of build a process on it. Started really small, and then all of a sudden they get a little bit bigger and a little bit more in depth, and then covering everything and stuff like that. So great resource there. And also too, you can reach out to Gary Harper at Sharper Processes. They're the ones that helped us out a lot, like cleaned up stuff for us. So Gary's wife, Susan's like, she's the process lady, knows everything about that kind of stuff. So there are people that can help you out there too. That's one of the things I always hear a lot from entrepreneurs, or, Brett is a good case in point like this, but there's a ton of Bretts out there that are visionaries. And like, I can't create a document. I can't figure this out. You don't have to, like, just get it on video, or just start recording yourself and explaining what you want to happen, and have somebody kind of clean it up for you, make it nice and neat for you. And there's people that can do that for you, and systems that can do that for you. Some online systems, and you don't have to overcomplicate it or anything like that. Maybe just that recording or that video is what you need. So hopefully this helped everybody out a little bit. If you have any questions about this, don't hesitate to reach out to me, Brian at simplewholesaling.com, or Brett at simplewholesaling.com. More than happy to help you out with it. Processes are things that a lot of people get overwhelmed by. Maybe they don't like to talk about, or don't even think about. But it's something that I think if you're in that position of like, hey, I'm working on this business and it's working pretty well, but I'm ready to take it to the next level. I've always said, and I've always heard that like it takes a little bit of time to get those processes in place, but when you're ready to take it to that next level, those processes are the thing that makes the difference from, being successful and like kind of falling down a little bit, and figuring out from there. So get those processes in place. You got the process, the procedure, the policies, get those in place to help you out. And hopefully I can take your business to the next level. And hopefully this podcast is a great resource for you to be able to take your business to the next level as well when it comes to investing in Indianapolis. That's all we got. So we will see you guys next time on the Indy Investor Pod. Take care.